welcome back to Food Prep Guide. We're in the kitchen today and I want to have a canning chat with you. I would like to share 10 of the things that I wish I knew before I started canning. Some of this might be just common knowledge to people, but it certainly wasn't to me when I first started canning. Some of them are like little tips and tricks for things to help the canning process go smoother, and just some general knowledge that I have picked up on along the way that if I had known it before I started canning or right when I started canning, I feel like I could have produced more and a better quality and with less worry in my mind about accidentally poisoning my family. So with that said, let's get started with number 1. Welcome to Food Prep Guide. My name is Jordan. I'm a homeschooling mom to 3, living on 3 beautiful acres with my wonderful husband. A health crisis forced our family to change the way we think about food. Unfortunately, it also put us in financial hardship. Thankfully, the solution to both challenges was the same: to live off the land as much as possible. For us, that means growing a garden, preserving the harvest, raising chickens, and cooking from scratch. It's definitely a family affair. And friends too. Meet Stacy, researcher, author, and lifelong learner. She entered the world of food preservation in the crazy days of 2020. She joined a gleaning co-op and a local grocer offered her clearance produce in bulk, and so the adventure began. Together, we're reclaiming the old ways of food stewardship and teaching them to the next generation. If there's one thing you should know about us, it's that we love Jesus and seek to steward his blessings wisely. Our table always has room for one more, so y'all come join us. Number 1 is I wish I knew that botulism was preventable. When I first started canning, this is the thing that kept me from canning for so long, was the fear of botulism and accidentally poisoning my family. In my mind, before I started canning, before I really dug into the research, I thought that botulism was this thing that could somehow enter, like some kind of bacteria that could somehow enter the jar after the canning process. Even if everything was done right, I thought it was a bacteria that could still surface and still grow inside of a jar even after it had been canned properly. Of course, I know now that is not the case. Botulism is completely preventable by following the correct procedures. We have to either acidify something, we have to either pressure can it at really high temperatures for the duration of time needed to kill off the botulism spores, or we just have to not create an oxygen-free environment, which we can't do when we're canning. We have to have that oxygen-free environment, so we focus on the other two, acidity and pressure canning, long temperatures for a long time. If I had known that following the proper steps, that proper acidifying could completely eliminate the botulism risk, I would have gotten started so much sooner. Maybe I would have still been a little bit leery of like beans and meats and vegetables, but I would have jumped right into canning pickles and canning jams and canning canned fruit and all of those things that are already acidified that completely eliminate the risk of botulism as long as they maintain, or as long as you can them at the acidity to where botulism can't survive, which is going to be 4.6 or numerically lower. I always say numerically lower because the pH scale, as you know, it's kind of like opposite, where the lower the number, the higher the acidity. The higher the number numerically, the lower the acidity, and for some reason like that really threw me off in the beginning. So I always like to say numerically lower number below 4.6. So for instance, 3.7. That's perfectly fine acidity. Botulism can't survive. I don't have to, even give it a second thought. If I had known all that, I would have started canning much sooner. And that kind of brings us to point number 2 that I wish I had known. I wish I'd known about pH strips. So the pH strips are just like what you would use to test your fish tank water or your swimming pool water, or if you live on a well, we've had to test our well with pH strips before. But it's just something that can let you see something that you can't see with your eyes when you're canning without pH strips. It kind of turns the invisible visible, I guess you could say. And this has brought so much peace of mind when I was getting into canning a whole lot more recipes beyond just your typical pickles and jams and jellies. Being able to rip off a piece of this and dip it in and actually see what number it is it's completely taken all worry out of my mind, and it's something that I don't even think about it anymore. I still I still test every recipe because it's just, why not? It takes 10 seconds. And, why not have that extra peace of mind? So I do want to mention that in the past, I have talked about pH strips before, and they came in a little box. And I started noticing after about a year, the colors weren't matching up with the chart good. And I started feeling like it was no more reliable. So I do think there's something about, I kind of wonder if maybe the pH strips can expire. I'm not 100% sure on that. I don't know how they could expire, but I just know that I had been using that box of pH strips for a year, and I had noticed a pretty significant change in the colorations of the results not matching up with what was on the front. Now, number two thing I want to mention is I switched to these kombucha I hope I'm pronouncing that right, but these pH strips that are typically used for testing the pH of your kombucha or other fermented foods, but it also works good for canning as well, and they go in increments of 0.5. So instead of just doing 2, 3, 4, and 5, it's 2.53. 3.54, and I really like that as well. Another note is it comes in this roll and you just rip it off, and even before my pH strips were old, they were still, I never got like exactly a match. It was always in between colors is what I'm saying. But this one, it's like the colors match up exactly, and I can clearly see, okay, this is most definitely 3.5. It's not like 3.89 maybe, I can see exactly what it is. So I highly recommend these. I will link them in the description box below. But number two, I wish I had known about pH strips a lot earlier on. Okay, number three, I wish I knew that I could can beans in something other than water. Now these actually were canned in water. I went to my canning pantry to find one of my beans that I can in a broth, and I couldn't find any because we eat those, we eat through those so fast. We prefer them so much more to beans canned in water. I thought, not just with beans, but with all vegetables, I thought when I first started out that they all had to be canned in water, that it wasn't even an option to use any other liquid. Now there's some caveats, so I won't say like a blanket statement, you can use anything, because you can't, but I'm just saying when it comes to canning vegetables and beans, you can use broths. Chicken broth, beef broth, vegetable broth, those are the three ones I can think of. Onion broth, oh, onion broth, so good. And when I started canning beans, and it was actually an accident, I had so much left over. We had processed a bunch of chickens, and I was doing all the bones in my crock pot, creating some bone broth. And I had another round. Well, the first round I did was just chicken broth without the bones, but then I did another round of the bone broth. So I had tons of the chicken broth left over, and I had already canned so much, and I knew that I was completely out of beans. I was like, I'm gonna, I looked it up real quick in a book that I had. Is it safe to can beans in chicken broth? And it absolutely was. And then I learned on from there, it's fine to do it in beef broth and vegetable broth and onion broth. The only caveat that I would just like kind of put out there is if you are canning something that, let's pretend you only have to pressure can it for 30 minutes. And let's pretend that your beef broth has to be canned for, I don't know, I can't remember off the top of my head, 40 minutes. Let's just pretend. If the beef broth has to be canned for 40 minutes and your beans only have to be canned for 30 minutes, you need to can it for the highest amount of time for whatever ingredient is in here. Now, for broths, even though they are, let's say, chicken and beef, even though they're meat-based, they don't have to be pressure canned for the times that meats have to be pressure canned. They can be pressure canned a lot lower. I'm slipping my mind the exact number. I do not want to tell you all the wrong things, so I'm just not even going to say a number. But it's not an issue. The beans have to be canned for 75 minutes in pints and 90 minutes in quarts, and all of your chicken broth, beef broth, and vegetable broth, and onion broth, they're all canned at a much lower time, so it doesn't affect that at all. You just can your normal time for beans, but you have this delicious broth, and it is so good, especially the chicken broth and the onion broth. I still have plenty of beans left over with just water, and that's just when I don't have any broths on hand. But like I said, we're completely out, and when I get them on the shelf, they fly off the shelves as fast as I can get them on whenever they're canned in a broth. So good. Okay, so number 4 thing I wish I knew that I could take Sharpie off of the canning lids. Now, I don't typically reuse canning lids for canning, although sometimes I do. We do have a separate video on reusing canning lids, about do's and don'ts, what you might want to do, what you might want to research as you make the decision on if it's something that you want to do in your kitchen. And I will link that in the description box below about reusing canning lids. But I reuse all of my canning lids. It just won't be necessarily for canning products. It'll be for my freeze-dried jars or my dehydrated jars or my rice and sugar and flour and things like that. But when I first started out, I would just draw a line through here, and I would write something on here. And then I would draw a line through that, and then I would come and squiggle something over here. But I didn't know that I could easily take the Sharpie off with just some alcohol. So all you need is rubbing alcohol and a cotton ball, and you just put the alcohol on there and rub it off. It really is that simple. Now I have noticed that, I hope did I show the lid before with the writing on it? Yes, I did. Okay, okay, good. But I have noticed that some of my older 4 jars lids, the rubbing alcohol doesn't really come off very good. It doesn't take the Sharpie off very good. So I do kind of wonder if maybe it's something to do with the type of metal that the lid is made out of. But for the most part, this alcohol trick works with most of the lids that I have. Okay, so I wish I knew that. Number 5, I wish I knew that I could mix pint jars and half pint jars. And not even that. We could go, you can mix quart jars and pint jars. You can mix and match the sizes in your canner. Now, the rule that we follow with that is you always can for the amount of time for the largest jar. So the larger the jar, the longer the canning time, right? So a pint-sized jar is not going to be canned for the same amount of time as a half pint jar in general. Every now and then there are some recipes. I'm thinking of a blueberry jam recipe where the half pints and the pints are the exact same time. But for the most part, pints are going to be canned longer than half pints. So when you're mixing jar sizes, you just want to do the canning time for the largest size jar. The same thing would be true if you wanted to mix pints and quarts. Just use the same, or use the largest jar size to determine your canning time. Now, you do want to do this recipe by recipe because there are some things that you do not want to over process because they'll end up mushy. I'm thinking mostly about pickles. We want our pickles nice and crisp, and canning them for way longer than they need to be is just going to end up in a mushy pickle. So I wouldn't say I would want to mix and match jars all the time, but it works a lot of times. Okay, number 6, let me get my notes here. Oh yes. I wish I knew that I could stack jars in the canner and get more done in a single canner load. So I wanted to show you, oops, I forgot my thing. Let me get it real quick. Here it is. Okay, canning rack. I said thingy, I couldn't think of the word. Canning rack. So I wanted to demonstrate how to stack jars just in case you're brand new and just don't know how. But basically, when you're stacking jars, you have to have something in between the jars. Now, you know, physically, is it possible to balance the jars on top of another jar in your canner? Yes, it is. But for safety purposes and to avoid shattering jars, we need to have a layer in between. Normally, the rack that comes either with your water bath canner kit or the pressure canner kit. Most water bath canning kits don't actually come with this because it's generally mostly needed for pressure canning, but some of them do, some of them don't. Mine didn't. But you can buy just the rack itself, and it's really nice for stacking. So I'm going to take these half pint jars here, and let's just pretend I have my canner, and I'm going to do 5, let's do 6 jars on the bottom. And canners are round, obviously, so I'm doing a roundness here, and then I'm just going to balance the rack on top of that, and then we can stack our jars. I do have them upside down, but you obviously wouldn't want to do that. I don't want to confuse anybody. Let me put these upright. I don't know why I did that upside down, but you don't want to do that in your canner. You want your jars upright, stack on, and then just start balancing your jars on your rack. Okay, just like that. And the rule that we need to follow when we are stacking jars in our canner is that the water level has to be still, the jars have to still be completely submerged by at least 1 inch of water. I always do 2 inches of water because of evaporation. I'm going to be losing some water level, so I just always go for 2 inches. But your water level would need to be about right here, so you can only stack if your canner is deep enough to still submerge all of these jars by at least 1 inch of water. Okay, I'll just leave that there for now. Okay, number 7, I wish I knew the hack to avoid cloudy jars. We live on a well and we have hard water, and those mineral deposits can get into our the canner water because the water comes from the well, and it can make our our jars cloudy. And I have one jar that's a little bit cloudy and one jar that is really perfectly clear. I hope you can tell the difference. I don't have a whole lot of cloudy jars anymore. It took me a while to find this one because once I learned that trick, I use that all the time, and now my jars come up nice and clear. But I hope the camera can pick up a little bit of a difference than that in those two jars. I think so. Okay, so the trick is just to put a splash of vinegar water, white distilled vinegar, in your canner, whether it be water bath canner or pressure canner. I don't measure, I just do a splash. I do like 1, 2, count 2 seconds, but it's probably the equivalent to maybe a tablespoon, 2 tablespoons. But I just pour that in my canner water when I'm prepping all my other stuff, and then I don't have to worry about my jars turning out cloudy. I wish I knew that from the very beginning, and I wouldn't have so many ugly jars. They're fine, perfectly usable, right? Perfectly usable, but just not as pretty as the pristine clear ones. Okay, number 8. Oh yes, this was a big one. So I wish I knew early on that the jars didn't have to be sterilized in most cases. So when I first started canning, I learned incorrectly that all the jars had to be sterilized like manually by hand. You know, I had to dip the jars in the canner, bring them up to a boiling, let them boil for like 10 minutes, I think it was, before I can move on with the rest of my canning process. Now, I'm not going to say that's incorrect information. That is one way to guarantee perfectly sterile jars, but we now know that as long as your canning recipe will process for 10 minutes or longer, the sterilization process happens during the canning process, as long as it runs for 10 minutes or more. And most recipes do. The only ones I can think of are sometimes pickles every now and then. If the acidity level is pretty high, if it's a really acidic brine, they only have to water bath for 5 minutes. And I do have a jelly recipe that only water baths for 5 minutes. So there are exceptions, and for those, I'll put them in my canner and boil those and go ahead and get those nice and sterile, that I don't have to worry about anything later on. We are investing time. We don't want to cut corners, of course, but as long as your canning recipe cans for 10 minutes or longer, the sterilization process is already happening for you in the canner, and you can save that amount of time. Wish I knew that. Okay, number 9 is, I wish I knew that I could can the meat with the bones in it. I had no idea that bone-in meats were a thing with canning. I never even thought to look into it. I just automatically deboned all my meat. And I think that's, even now that I know, I still choose that route, right? Because one of the reasons why we can, or at least for me, it's meal prep. It makes supper time so much easier. And yes, we're preserving the harvest, and yes, we're preserving our chickens and all that stuff. But it's also saves so much time when it comes time to cook dinner. So I don't want to have to take the time to peel out all those bones, but there is a use case for keeping the bones in. Number 1, what if you come across a killer deal on bone-in chicken drumsticks, but you don't have, an hour and a half to sit there and peel apart all of that meat on those bones. You can just stuff your drumsticks straight in there and save time that way. But the second use case, which is more common for us, is when we process our chickens. It can be an all-day thing, and by the time we are done processing chickens, I don't even want to look at a chicken. I don't want to smell. The smell. Oh. If you've ever processed a fresh bird, a fresh chicken, the smell is just, it's just terrible. And anyway, I don't want to come in and then have to deal with all of that raw meat for a long period of time, like deboning it and just all that. So on chicken processing days, it's a whole lot easier to just cut up the chicken into quarters or 5 parts, whatever, and stick them in the jar and can them that way. And I will just know, hey, it's going to be worth it to spend about 10 minutes when it comes time to cook supper. Just go ahead and debone it, because it allowed me to get done with that nasty chicken smell and all of that hard work when I'm worn out from doing that. So there are definitely some benefits of canning bone-in meats. It's not just chicken, it's other things too. But you can absolutely can with the bones in. For the most part, The canning times are different for bone-in meats versus boneless meats, so be sure to look that up if you ever do try to can with the bones in them. Okay, number 10, and I think this is the last, although I do have a bonus for you. And number 10 is I wish I knew that I could recan number 10 cans. Some people ask, why would you even want to, which I totally get it. But a lot of times, if the number 10 cans, at least in my area, if they have even the slightest bit of a dent in it, you can get a good discount on them. And the price per ounce is usually lower anyway, and then you get a slight dent in it, and it takes that price down even more, and it can be a really good deal. But you know, once you open it, you've got to eat it or freeze it. So canning them into single serving size jars is just a convenient way to capitalize on the savings on those number 10 cans. But the second way, the way that I take advantage most often of number 10 cans is when I'm stretching my tomato harvest to make all of the tomato things at the end of the season, when I'm trying to get all of my pasta sauce and pizza sauce and diced tomatoes and salsa and tomato powder and some freeze-dried slices and just all the tomato things. You can get a number 10 can of tomato sauce from the store for $4 or $5, and that's not on sale. That's full price. And you can use that sauce to make your homegrown tomatoes or tomatoes bought from the farmer's market. You can make those stretch with a number 10 can of tomato sauce. We have a whole playlist on recanning number 10 cans of tomato sauce and how we repurposed it into multiple different recipes, and I will link that down in the description box below. Okay, for the bonus, that was 10, but I'm going to give you a bonus. I wish I knew how to hold the jar lifter correctly. I thought about, do I really want to say this out loud? And I have mentioned this in passing on a very past video, like one of the first videos we ever did. But I think it's just really funny, and I think it's good to laugh at ourselves and to know that, hey, if you mess up or you don't know all the things about canning, it's okay. We all have to start somewhere. I used to hold it like this. I thought that, and I even as I was using it, I was like, this is the most ridiculous design I've ever seen. Who in the world designed this? It's terrible. And I would, you know, try my best to open it like this, hold it. I mean, it totally doesn't work, and yet I did this for like my first 3 or 4 canning times. And look how difficult this is. And I would very carefully balance it over, and it's just ridiculous. And you want to know who corrected me? My then 7-year-old daughter. She walked through the kitchen one day while I was canning. She said, "You know you're holding that upside down, right?" She has never seen anybody can. I was just now learning how to can. She's never been around anybody who can, so how did she know? I mean, it is pretty intuitive. Oh well. Anyway, this is how you hold it. This is how you operate it. Okay, y'all. I hope that was helpful to you. Top 10 things I wish I knew about canning before I got started. I hope that shaves off a little bit of learning curve for you. Well, that's all for today. We'll see you next time. Bye.